This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Welcome again to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Today, our many-time contributor, Chris, and I are going to talk about topics of alcoholism, suicide, drug abuse, and other sensitive themes through the 1995 movie Leaving Las Vegas. We aren't graphic by any means, but these are themes that might not be appropriate for all audiences. So with that warning out of the way, let's get on with the show. And as usual, thanks to Chris for joining me. I always have fun talking to him, and I know I always learn something. You can support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon now. By joining on Patreon, you help keep Beyond the Big Screen going and get many great benefits. Go to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more. By supporting Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon, you are going a long way to help make this podcast sustainable and available for a long time in the future. A special thanks goes out to our supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar. Thank you today to our executive producer, Alex. Another way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These reviews help me know what you think about the show and help other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. More about the Parthenon Podcast Network can be found at parthenonpodcast.com. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, great movies, and stories so great they should be movies by going to the website beyondthebigscreen.com. You can also find out how to support the show there as well. With that, I thank you for joining me again, Beyond the Big Screen. All right, today we are talking about the 1995 movie Leaving Las Vegas, directed by Mike FAUS and based on the 1990 novel Leaving Las Vegas by John O'Brien. This movie stars Nicolas Cage as Ben Sanderson and Elizabeth Shue as his sort of girlfriend Sarah, and a great cameo by AR IIE. Now today we are joined again by Chris to talk about this movie. It really, the basic concept of this movie is about a washed up writer named Ben, played by Nicolas Cage, who has in some way imploded his life. Ben is absolutely mired in a deep depression and alcoholism, and he decides to leave Los Angeles and move to Las Vegas, where he plans to drink himself to death. So this is going to be, I'd say, one of the heavier episodes of Beyond the Big Screen. And in this episode, just a little bit of a content warning, this episode will necessarily dive into themes of addiction and suicide. So it may be particularly disturbing to some people in the audience. If you're struggling with any of these issues, I highly suggest you contact your healthcare provider. If you live in the United States or Canada, you can now connect to the Suicide Prevention Lifeline by simply dialing 988. If you need them, call them. Don't wait. You just have to simply dial the numbers 988, a 3-digit code, just like 911, except in this case, 988, and talk with someone. So with that, there will be spoilers. And like I said, this will be a little bit heavier than we normally talk about. Now, Chris, as a lifelong Nicolas Cage fan, what drew you to this movie in particular, 1995's Leaving Las Vegas?
Yeah, so when I was younger, I watched all like Nicolas Cage's like action movies, and I started getting more into some of his smaller roles. And the first time I watched Leaving Las Vegas, I had heard he won an Oscar for it, and Roger Ebert gave like rave reviews for it. And when first time I watched it, I was just absolutely mesmerized by Nicolas Cage's performance and the character Ben Sanderson. He fills me with, I've never really had a character quite horrify me and mesmerize me at the same time, where I'm completely horrified by Ben Sanderson, but I can't stop watching this movie. I can't stop thinking about him. Like every time I watch this movie, I catch myself during the day thinking about Ben Sanderson. It's quite it's actually quite accurate with how most people, and this has been my experience of, if you know somebody close to you that's dealing with alcohol addiction or drug addiction that you really care about, you'll find yourself being horrified at what they're doing to themselves. And then you'll catch yourself during the day thinking about them, like, how can I help this person? What can I do?
Yeah, I think for this episode, we really, as we talked this out and planned this episode out, we both came to the differing conclusions, but kind of the same conclusion at the end is, do you take this movie? And I'll say when I first watched it in 1995, so that's going on almost 30 years ago, I took it in the literal view that Ben Sanderson was going from Las Vegas or from Los Angeles to Las Vegas to drink himself to death. That's what he stated. And so seeing it as kind of a realistic portrayal, but now watching it again, I almost feel that this movie could be really portrayed in an anti-fairy tale way. And I think we both came to this conclusion that it's not necessarily a realistic view of Sanderson's life, but maybe almost a dream sequence for him, a hallucination of Ben. And I think we both came to this from slightly different directions. And I wonder, just before we even get started with diving into the issues too much, what did you think and how did your thinking evolve in this movie?
Yeah, quite like you. Well, actually, the first time I watched this movie, when they go to the resort, him and Sarah, and she starts pouring liquor on herself and Ben's, licking her up or what have you. Earlier in the movie, Ben does like a monologue where he basically says the exact same thing that Sarah's doing. And it was at that moment I started thinking to myself, I go, is this really happening? Or is this something that Ben is daydreaming? And then after multiple watches, I started noticing like a couple other things that get said throughout the movie that made me question whether this is 100% reality, or is it 100% like the drunk daydream of a screenwriter? Like he says to Sarah that she's an angel from his drunk fantasy, and one of his drunk fantasies. So that there's an example right there. When he first goes into Sarah's apartment, he sees a giant picture of like an angel, and then that immediately says like, oh, you're an angel. And then at the very beginning of the movie, it's a very good song. It's by Sting called Angel Eyes. And one of the first lines in the movie is, are you slowly losing your mind? You look around each corner hoping that she's there. And once you take like all these things into combination together, you start thinking to yourself, it almost comes across as like a hardcore alcoholic like Ben, who's obviously was at one point a very talented screenwriter, kind of daydreamed this fairy tale in his head about Sarah and going to Vegas. And that's why it seems like it's almost like an anti-fairy tale, because it's coming from the drunk imaginations of like a hardcore alcoholic that is suicidal.
When I first started watching the movie, what one of the first few clues that I got that things were maybe not exactly what they seemed was, to me, the dialogue seemed very almost stiff between Sarah and Ben, forced. And when you think about it, it almost sounds like a playwright or a screenwriter working through a first draft of a script. Yeah. And then as you start going back into that whole section, there's the whole section in Los Angeles. And if you notice, they don't roll the beginning credits or show the name of the movie until about a half an hour into the movie when he leaves Los Angeles. Maybe it's 20-ish minutes. It's a long ways into the movie.
Yeah, about 15. Yeah, I'd say about 15, 20 minutes. Yeah.
And you see that clear break, that beginning act of the movie in Los Angeles is completely different than the whole rest of the movie. And I think that going back and thinking about it, that was the end of his real life, was at the end of Act 1 of the movie.
Yeah, and even the tone is different, because I mean, the movie has like a dark tone throughout the entire thing, but that first part of the movie is basically we're seeing just how screwed up Ben's life is and how like hopelessly addicted he is to alcohol. And then like once it cuts to like Vegas, it's not that the tone it does kind of lighten up a little bit because like Ben is joking around and he's like legitimately funny. Whereas like those first 15 minutes, his friend that he asks money for tells him to bugger off, never talk to him again. His boss has to let him go. He gets kicked out of like this dive bar I assume he frequent all the time. The bartender just can't deal with it anymore. And then it cuts to him going to his house, burning pictures of his former life where he was married and had a kid, and he's burning all his screenplays. And then once he goes to Las Vegas, the tone lightens up a little bit, at least initially.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting in that first scene, one of the first scenes where he's in a bar and he tries to pick up a single woman sitting at the bar, and he just completely strikes out because he's really, really intoxicated. And she's slightly amused by it because Ben Sanderson is a somewhat clever person. He has some charisma to it, but she's also completely grossed out by it too because he is so absolutely drunk. But then you go to Las Vegas and he has the Elizabeth Shue's character Sarah just completely falls for him, and you see they set up these different the two dichotomies there just along the way of the women are either mildly amused at him or they find him abhorrent, but the exact opposite happens in Las Vegas. They're accepting of who he is, and I think that really is, it shows that it's got to be some sort of fairy tale that he's creating in his mind, knowing that he's going to kill himself.
And then, yeah, you also met like in Los Angeles when he goes to go pick up a hooker in Los Angeles. And I was saying this to you, like that whole sequence of when he leaves the bar and he goes to a strip joint and he chugs a whole Mickey back, and the patron like beside him is like, oh my God, like, are you okay? And he's drinking and driving. He's on the way to go pick up the hooker. There's a scene and the camera just kind of focuses on him slurring his words, and they even slow down the speed. Like the look on his face there is more horrifying than most things that I've seen in horror films. And what does the hooker do that he picks up there? She steals his wedding ring. And then, but when he goes to Vegas, Elizabeth Shue is totally different. She's like almost like an angel.
I think if you watch the movie and you initially watch it, and I think people should initially watch it without even honestly listening to us talk about it, because if you watch it in that first brush and you take it as just reality, like I took it, that this is his story playing out, I don't think it's a particularly great movie. It's okay, in my opinion. But I think if you go back and you look at it as Ben's fairy tale to himself, it's a fantastic movie. It's one of the best I've ever seen.
Yeah, and it, like even if you watch it initially and you take it just for what it is, like you pointed out, it's to me, Nicolas Cage's performance is what really carries the whole thing, right? Like I pointed out earlier, this combination of like you're horrified by this person, but you're mesmerized by them, then you'll walk away from the movie and you won't be able to stop thinking about Ben Sanderson. But then once you add this, like kind of like, is this like a drunk fairy tale? It gets the movie, even though it's dark, it gets even darker when you start realizing that this is the outward like perception of like a horrific drunk screenwriter's idea of like his, I don't know, like a happy, tragic ending to his life. It's really, really dark.
It really is. When you look at it, you can only expect that when that little bit you get to know about him, because they really don't build up a lot of exposition about what ruined Ben's life. And he says it, I don't know if my wife left me because I was an alcoholic, or I became an alcoholic because my wife left me. He doesn't even know it anymore. And I think they purposefully keep the whole background story of him obscured so that we don't think too much about it. But it clearly something got ruined at some point in his life to get him to where he's going to kill himself.
Yeah, and it's even in terms of like alcoholics, I would say like Ben's on the extreme end of the alcoholic spectrum. And I guess that's another thing too, where like you'll find yourself thinking about Ben. It's, what could have happened for a guy to get to this point? Who's highly like a successful screenwriter in Los Angeles. He has a Rolex, he's got nice suits, he's got fancy friends. It's, you'll catch yourself thinking about it all the time, and I don't know, you'll get depressed thinking about it, but then you'll be like, there's a part of you that wants to know like exactly what happened to Ben. Like I've said this before. I mean, I think they legitimately could have done like a prequel showing how Ben got to the point maybe that he got to where he started daydreaming this drunk fantasy, and it would have worked. It wouldn't have seemed like, oh, they're just kind of cashing in on this success of the first one. There was room to add to the story. It's, but then maybe you would have lost some of that mystery, the mystery of Ben Sanderson.
Yeah, I think that mystery in a lot of ways really was what made this movie so captivating, is that we don't know what got him to that point, and it really doesn't matter. He's at that point. I think another little clue to me that he never even left Los Angeles is that he drinks the entire drive. Yeah, in Las Vegas, when he drinks, he becomes almost incapacitated. I don't even think that he was capable of making that drive by himself.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think I looked this up, to drive from like Los Angeles to Las Vegas, I believe is like a 5-hour, 6-hour drive. If you were drinking that entire time, which Ben physically has to drink, otherwise he'll start shaking, which is a symptom of late stage alcoholism. I don't know how he would have been able to do it. 5-6 hour drive, probably chugging back a 26er of vodka, mixed probably a couple of beers. I don't know how he would have been able to do it, honestly.
I find it kind of interesting, too, that you look at Sarah. She looks a lot like the pictures of his wife that he was burning up when he left Los Angeles. I think, and the teller in the bank looked a lot like the picture of his wife. And I think he really must have just been churning through all these emotions. And that's what came out. I wonder if he may have actually wrote down this final act in his life.
Yeah, it's very possible. Like when he's burning all the stuff in his house, you can see like it's like screenplay after screenplay. There's like, he has a whole room filled with screenplays that he partially wrote or wrote himself. And it almost seems like Sarah's like a combination of like different women, I guess, that he's seen in his life. Like she does kind of look like his wife in the two pictures that we do see of her, and she looks like that girl at the teller at the bank. And maybe Sarah's he combines a little bit here and there, and that's Sarah.
Maybe you can explain Sarah a little bit, because she's a complicated character.
Yeah, so Sarah's she's a hooker in Las Vegas. She actually used to be in Los Angeles herself too. She came to Las Vegas trying to get away from her pimp, from my understanding, her pimp Yuri, and she figured there's more money in Las Vegas anyways, which is probably a good bet for a hooker. And so Yuri comes, he ends up finding her, and he's doing work. She ends up doing work for Yuri again, but she's like a hooker that works the streets of Las Vegas and the casinos. And she's an interesting character in the sense that she's not like ashamed of being a hooker. She's quite proud of it, in a sense. Like one of the first times we see her talking, she's talking about like how she can go in a room and she knows exactly what the guy or the girl wants, and she's more than happy to perform whatever fantasy, and they don't even have to articulate it. She can just kind of look at a guy and she knows, okay, this is the type. But she suffers from, as I assume probably many street hookers do, and people who kind of live like lifestyles like that, she suffers from an overwhelming sense of loneliness, because there's very few people that will be understanding of like a hooker, and understand, oh, that's what she does, and yet have a relationship with this person. Like, I'm sure it happens, but it's not very often.
The one thing that I tried to try and figure out in my mind about the narrative arc between Ben and Sarah is that I guess Sarah is completely enamored with Ben in every single way. That's another clue that to me that it's a fantasy, is that for Ben, he has Elizabeth Shue fall in love with him absolutely without any reservations within the first time she sees him. And it really, I think that she is so devoted to him, no matter how, at the resort out in the desert, he falls and breaks a table, and he has glass all stuck in his back, and he just makes a fool out of himself and her throughout the thing, and she always stays completely devoted to him. I don't see that as a realistic portrayal. I think that she would have naturally have just gotten completely sick of him. But if he created a character of a person who is 100% devoted to him, that would make a lot of sense, especially where Ben Sanderson would be at the end of his life.
I guess the argument, like, kind of against that would be, not so much against that, is like, Ben is, he's completely self-aware that he's a screw up and a hardcore alcoholic. What better person to have no, like, inhibitions to just accept a hooker for who she is? Like, in a sense, like, Ben's alcoholism is what made him and Sarah's relationship possible.
Yeah, I guess that she herself recognizes that she is psychologically, emotionally, physically damaged by her life choices, and that you could take that in a realistic way, that she can maybe find some redemption for herself through seeing Ben through his final act.
I don't know, it's just something that I thought about myself too when me and you were discussing. Well, not just me and you. I've been thinking about this film for a really long time, and it's. I guess it would take somebody kind of like Ben to get over the fact that, not get over the fact, to just kind of accept that she's a hooker. Because, I mean, really, what leg does he have to stand on? He's an alcoholic, and she's, I mean, for the most part, is kind of accepting of it, but then she's not totally, because she asks him at one point, like, I want you to go see a doctor. And Ben says, I'm not seeing a doctor. So you can tell that she was willing to go along with it to a degree, but then she cares about Ben. She doesn't want him to die, but she signed up for that, like, at the beginning. And then, Ben had told her, like, you can't ever tell me to stop drinking, and this is what I'm going to do. And that's not going to change.
Yeah, he wants 100% total acceptance of who he is. And that's probably what blew up all of his relationships back in Los Angeles. He was unwilling to get cleaned up. His friend, I believe the one was played by Steven Weber, and the other one was I can't remember. He's a big actor from the 80s. And then, of course, his wife. They wanted to help him. They desperately wanted to help him, but they also wanted him to stop. And he clearly had the type of personality that he wasn't going to stop. And he wanted to, I think that's what either the reality or the fantasy of Las Vegas was, that he didn't have to stop, and he didn't have to accept what other people were saying that he had to do. He could do exactly what he wanted. And maybe Sarah was real. Maybe she was a figment of his imagination, that the person who was going to give in on everything that he wanted.
Yeah, well, yeah, and he moves to Las Vegas, and to get away from everybody. And the first person he finds is somebody. It's like, I'm fine that you throw up on yourself and stumble all over the place, and you sleep at odd hours of the night, and you shake and you tremble and you have, like, hallucinations. It's all good. It doesn't seem, it seems like a fairy tale.
What did you think about the imagery of the flask? Sarah buys a series of presents for Ben, and we can maybe talk about those presents, but she buys him a flask, and that seems to me that, again, could that be just a complete, like, his dream, his absolute dream, that this woman's she knows I'm an absolute hardcore alcoholic who's trying to kill myself, but she's gonna go and buy me a flask. She's going to completely embrace that. What do you think?
Well, and it's not like, not only is she just going to turn a blind eye to my drinking, she's going to actively encourage it by buying me a flask and giving me a tool that's going to help me kill myself, which is what I wanted to do, which is what he wants to do. It seems, I mean, you can interpret it that like Sarah's just kind of showing that like she's 100% like accepting of who Ben is, but I mean, it seems like a stretch to me personally. But his reaction to the flask is, it's genuine. He's absolutely shocked that somebody would buy him that. Probably be based on, his life back in Los Angeles would be the last thing that somebody would probably buy him. They'd probably buy him like a coffee machine or a stint in rehab.
What do you think about the other gifts? They seem so odd and so purposeful that Sarah buys him a shirt, and just some odds and ends that it doesn't seem to really fit together. What do you think was going on there?
The orange shirt I thought was kind of interesting because it's so different from all the other clothes that we've seen him wear. Like, he typically was wearing like dark clothes, and Sarah comes and buys him like this bright orange shirt that doesn't really quite fit with all the other stuff that he wears. I just thought that was interesting. It's almost like he puts on this orange shirt and he's becoming like a new man.
Yeah, and it really, the whole thing just goes, he has one falter that even he thinks is falter when he brings in another prostitute, and he gets busted by Sarah and she kicks him out of the house. That's the only time where she's really ever mad at him. And then she does go and find out where he's staying and goes and visits him. I think that, again, that kind of points to maybe he's writing in himself a little bit of a narrative arc that he falls, but it still never changes his attitude. That was the one thing that I thought was really interesting, is he is constant. Ben is constant. He's never says that or makes any intimation that he's going to try redemption or try and find some path out of what he's chosen. His goal is like a laser beam.
And initially too, like when the relationship just starts between him and Sarah, he warns Sarah, like, I do not want to force my twisted soul into your life, because Ben, and he cries saying it because he knows, he's self-aware enough to know that like he's I don't want to say like a demonic individual, but he's a very sick individual with like sick, twisted thoughts and a sick addiction. And the only thing that he brings with him is chaos and heartache. And he's basically telling Sarah, like, this is what I'm going to bring. Like, I don't want to force this onto you. And you mentioned Ben picking up the other hookers. I actually think he did that on purpose, in my opinion. The scene before that, she's trying to get Ben to eat some plain rice. That's another cool thing that they did in this movie. I don't know if you noticed it. Ben literally does not eat the entire movie, which is, if you've ever had any or known any kind of hardcore alcoholics in your life, it's something that you'll notice. They rarely, and I've talked to hardcore alcoholics about this too, and it's stomach turning to them, and then their brain, they think if they eat, then the booze isn't going to take hold as strongly. In Ben's case, it's probably because he literally can't eat because he's consumed so much alcohol. And she asks him to go to the doctors in that scene. He says, like, I'm not going to the doctors. And she gets very upset and she starts crying. And Ben mentions, I think maybe it might be time that I move out. And Sarah's like, well, you can't do that. So Ben, I think, came up with this plan in his head that if I brought home another woman, maybe she'll kick me out and I don't have to keep on doing this to her. That's my opinion. That's what I think. I think that he did it. He set it up. He did it on purpose like that.
Yeah, I think I mean, that's likely what happened. And I wonder, but so if it is a fairy tale, what is that saying about where Ben is at in his trip to his ultimate death and demise? What's he trying to say about that?
He could be saying, even my sick, dark, twisted soul, I can have moments where I show compassion to the people that I care about. Even though I'm laser focused on ending my own life, it doesn't mean I have to cause all this pain and suffering to everybody else. And I think that's why in his drunk daydream, he actually just leaves Los Angeles. I think there's a part of him that's just sick and tired of hurting all these people around him. And if he goes to Las Vegas, none of those people are around. They don't have to watch. They don't have to watch what he's going to do to himself.
He probably really has in his mind too that I've so completely destroyed my relationship with my wife, my son, all of my colleagues, my boss, all these people who put their trust in me and who honestly cared for him. That physical break, and maybe that in a lot of ways, by bringing that other woman back to Sarah's apartment, is him playing out that last thing that, yeah, this is what I do to people. I hurt them. Maybe
Yeah.
trying to investigate it, look into his own selfishness and maybe of what got him to that point.
Yeah, it's very that's a good interpretation too. Like that's very possible too. And I guess like the final scene, because that whole thing, it happens quite quickly actually, and they both go their separate ways. Yeah, so Sarah ends up getting into her own personal trouble. We're not gonna It's a very rough scene, but we warned you guys at the beginning of the movie that this was at the beginning of the podcast. This is a very rough movie, right? This is another part of the thing where I think it's almost kind of like a drunk fairy tale, because Sarah ends up going back to her apartment. She gets kicked out of her apartment and she's somewhere. We don't exactly know where. And she gets a phone call and it's Ben. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, because she goes looking for Ben too. She goes back to the old motel that he was at and nobody knows where he is. And Ben calls, and even initially when I first saw the movie, I thought to myself, well, this is another thing too. It's like, how did Ben get her number? There's no cell phones back then. But she picks up and it's Ben, and she goes to the place that Ben is staying at. And me and you are both in agreement here, is we both think that this room that Ben is in he never left this room, wherever this room is. She sees that Ben is a couple hours away, or even a couple days away. In the movie it's a couple hours, but he's right there. He's gonna die. And she comes to him and gives him comfort. And yeah, and Ben and even another part of that scene too is she comes in, it's total darkness, and the first thing she does is open the curtains and lets the light in like an angel.
And really in that final scene that they connect and that's really that's the end of it. We presume that Ben dies, and that's pretty much it. And then there's just a final little monologue scene where Sarah talks a little bit, but it really is, it's not the ending maybe you expect, that he has a soliloquy when he dies. It's just, I think it was the way he wanted to die, of just fading out.
Yeah, his last words are, after him and Sarah have relations, his last words are, "Wow." And then she wakes up in the morning and Ben has died. Another interesting part of that movie too is Sarah's telling Ben, this is before he passes away, like she loves him, and Ben's telling her that he loves her. And then he gets up for a second, and what does he grab? The very first thing he grabs is the bottle of liquor. He doesn't even grab Sarah. He grabs the bottle of liquor and starts drinking. And it just shows, once the addiction takes hold, you're not thinking rationally, not thinking normally.
I have really gone back and forth in my mind that did we need that setup and that exposition of how he became an alcoholic, or how his life crashed and burned to really understand the end and to understand why he got himself to that point? Or is it just a study in no matter what happened, he's an alcoholic in the most extreme form, and that is who he is at the end, no matter who he was before?
Yeah. The only reason I mentioned the prequel thing was just because I don't think it would have been like, oh, we're just trying to cash in. It would have been, I don't know, it just would have been interesting to see more of Nicolas Cage and Ben Sanderson, right? But it's not, it's not necessary. It really wouldn't change anything because, like you pointed out, at the end of the day, he's an extreme alcoholic.
I sure would have liked to have seen something at the end. I think and really seal the deal that this was some sort of dream, of sequence of him that whole rest of the movie after the first act in Los Angeles. I would have loved to have seen a little, give us a little hint that this really was a dream sequence. That's what I think, that there wasn't a piece of really hard evidence to say that it was. And I would have liked just something else, unless you think there was something really that puts the definitive point that it was a dream. Otherwise, I think that it maybe leaves it too wide open.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, like, to me, the Ben saying you're like an angel from one of my drunk fantasies, it seems, I don't say it's not on point, but it makes you think. And then like the whole him reciting that monologue at the bank, and then like the recreation at the resort, I don't know how long, like a couple days later, like at the resort, or a week later. It's just like these little things that add up that make you think. I think the reason why it works so brilliantly, though, is because you can interpret it as literally all this stuff happened and it still works, or you can interpret it as this is like the drunk daydream of an extreme alcoholic, and it works either way, in my opinion. To be quite honest with you, like I've said this theory to other people too about is this a drunk daydream? And some people kind of like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Like me and you, well, when me and you were talking, I said this to you initially and you thought, oh, it's the same thing. And I think I said to you, it's like, well, you're like one of the first people that like initially thought this exact same thing too. Like I said this to my wife and she didn't quite know how to take it. She just assumed it was literal, right?
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. I think in a lot of ways, it's so powerful in it. I think it sweeps you away the first time, maybe even the first couple of times, of the depths of his alcoholism and how much he has a bottle in his hand the entire time, and you could really get swept away with it. And I think you need to pick up on just a couple of different things that makes you start thinking that it really is his fairy tale ending.
Yeah. And like things that we pointed out so far in the podcast, I legitimately think you take all those things into account, you could make a very good argument that much of this movie is Ben's drunk daydream. And I don't think I listened to like a couple shows and read a couple reviews, and everyone just kind of assumes this is 100% real. I haven't quite heard. I'm maybe it's out there, but I really haven't quite heard anybody put forth this interpretation that it is a drunk daydream. Like I think me and you have I don't know, maybe stumbled something new. We'll start a revival of Leaving Las Vegas.
I think my wrap up for the movie is that whole rest of the movie in Las Vegas really harnesses what Nicolas Cage does as an actor. And that's why I think that if it is a dream sequence, that his over the top style of acting really lent itself towards it being a hallucination or his whatever was going on in his mind as a fantasy. I think that makes so much more sense to me, because he even acts in a much more subdued fashion in that beginning part. And to me, I think that as much as if anybody goes back and listens to our previous episode on Nicolas Cage, I'm not a huge Nicolas Cage fan, but I think that that whole part of the movie in Las Vegas, he really carries it off if it's not literal.
Well, and it perfectly demonstrates Nicolas. Like, this is the perfect type of movie for Nicolas Cage. Is the focus is on, him. It's like kind of almost, I wouldn't say it's a one-man show. Like Elizabeth Shue plays, it's a two-person show basically. There's all the other characters. There's really no one else, and it gives Nicolas Cage this space to do what he does best, which is kind of like these over the top emotions, these over the top expressions, and create this character that becomes mesmerizing. If people go back and listen to the other Nicolas Cage episode that we did, that's the thing that I mentioned in that episode, is like there's a lot of his performances I'm just mesmerized by what he's doing on screen, and in this movie in particular is the one I think he did it the best.
One more point that I'd make is I keep trying to get to in my mind to seal the deal with that it's a fantasy. And I think that you had brought it up a little bit earlier about how he was with the prostitute in Los Angeles, and you see it's a much grittier and grimier version. And then when he goes to Las Vegas, he finds the fairy tale version of prostitution and what he wants it to really be. I think that's that dichotomy that they set up there, and that's that the darkness and the light, and maybe that's where he finds his redemption, and not redemption, but maybe that's where he finds his heaven, if you will, with how he really wants things to be. It's in Las Vegas. It's in a different place, even if he actually didn't go there.
But you mentioned that, and I totally agree with that. But how messed up is that this is his version of, this is the hardcore alcoholic's version of heaven. He stumbles into he finds a hooker that falls in love with him, and he can just keep on drinking all he wants, and stumble all over the place and puke and still drink himself to death. Because I think even though it lightens up in LA, lightens up in Las Vegas, the core of the story is you're watching a guy that's decided that he's going to drink himself to death. He plans it out like almost to like a science. Like, it's going to take me 4 weeks, give or take. I'm going to need $200 a day to get this done. It's so pitch black.
To wrap it up today, a good way is to think about this Ben Sanderson, and really at the end of his life, when he's gone so far into his alcohol addiction that he can't function at work anymore, and he can't function as a father, and he can't function as a husband. What do you think got him to that point? Because he eased into that role. Do you maybe speak a little bit to alcohol addicts and how people like Ben Sanderson are functioning and then turn into a completely non-functioning people?
Without, like, Ben Sanderson's a fictional character, but from seeing it firsthand myself happen. And I've known an alcoholic like Ben Sanderson, maybe not as extreme, but I've known somebody who shook and sweat, had the dark rings under their eyes, like, and just looked sickly at all times. Which is pretty accurately depicted in the movie Leaving Las Vegas. Is it starts off as something, like, oh, they like going to the bars because they pick up girls or they hang out with their friends, and the booze, loosens them up a little bit, and then it becomes a little bit more booze, then it becomes more and more booze, and then it becomes something that they use to calm themselves down. It's something that they use. It's like, oh, I drank on Saturday, but Monday there's not much going on at work. I can probably tie a few on Sunday too. And then they wake up and, oh man, I'm really hungover. I know how to take care of a hangover, and they crack open a beer, or they have a couple of shots, and then they feel depressed, and then they start getting depression from the drinking. And how did they cure the depression from the drinking? Well, I'll just drink some more. And it slowly becomes a process like that. Before you know it, you find yourself that you're drinking throughout the entire day just to function, or you can't see yourself doing something without drinking. Like, you can't go to like a dinner without having alcohol at the dinner. You can't Why would I go to a movie theater? I can't drink at the movie theater. Why? Well, if I go with my friends, we're going to drink because this is what all me and my friends do. The thing with alcoholism, it's a very sneaky addiction because alcohol is so socially acceptable, and it's something that the immediate signs don't show right away. Where like heroin, you'll see track marks, or somebody smoking crack or meth. It becomes pretty apparent really quickly. Whereas somebody could be an alcoholic for many, many, many years, and maybe a lot of the people around them don't really know. I mean, you have talked about it. I have there's a part of me that's thinks like we should almost kind of talk about alcohol, especially alcohol abuse, the way we talk about other hard drugs. Not like make them illegal, but to just really stress how many people this affects every day, and how many people it kills every day. And even if it doesn't kill you right away, it totally destroys your body from the inside out. It's a poison. And if you even think like that you're maybe starting to have a problem with alcohol, go talk to somebody. Go talk to family members. Go talk to your doctor. Find, and then really look into yourself. How did you end up the process? And it's probably not much different than the one I laid out. How you got to this point, and then what are you going to do to try to change it? It's not an easy road, but it's something that if you do feel like you're having a problem, or people have brought it up to you before, to seriously consider.